Hello and welcome. I'm John Ryan with Broadsheet, and this is the third episode of a series of shows we're doing on the mother and baby homes in Ireland, and both north and south. On tonight's show, we are joined once again by Breeda Murphy, who is PRO of the Tuam Mother and Baby Home Alliance, and once again by adoptee, mother and baby home adoptee and activist Eunan Duffy, and a very special guest. We're very honoured to have Dr. Lorraine Grimes from NUIG, and you're very welcome as well, Lorraine. Dr. Lorraine, is it?
Yeah.
Dr. Grimes, okay. So Lorraine, Breeda and Eunan, good evening.
Good evening, John. Thanks, John.
One of the aspects, the two aspects we've spoken about, and Breeda perhaps can help me with this. The first one, we spoke to Karen from America, who discovered late in life that like Eunan, had been adopted. And last week we looked at Besborough, where housing development is being planned are under consideration to overlap what is possibly a children's burial site. And this week, one of the aspects that ahead of the Mother and Baby Home Commission's report on the 11th of January, or the week commencing the 11th of January, one of the many things that the Mother and Baby Home report will not consider are the women who took an alternative to the Mother and Baby Homes and emigrated. And Lorraine is going to talk me through that. Breeda, have I got all that right? I mean, none of those women are will be included in the Mother and Baby Home report.
Yeah, absolutely right, John. What may be included is that the women, when they were repatriated, which Lorraine will speak about, with or without their baby, or while they were still pregnant, if they were found out to be pregnant, the Catholic Protection and Rescue Society took them back to Ireland. So they may actually have been in the home for a period of time following the birth of the child for up to a year or 2 years. But Lorraine is the expert tonight, and
Absolutely.
I think we'll hand over to her.
Lorraine, just to open it then, can I, the legal adoption was introduced in Britain in 1926, and that then allowed women an outlet to go to Britain and adopt their child, have their child and then adopt it.
Yeah, and I'm sure women were emigrating before 1926 as well. But to have legal adoption in Britain might have been an extra or an additional reason as to why women would have emigrated. The legislation, however, kind of worked against Irish women going over for adoption, because they had a 6-week clause where you could only sign off on an adoption after 6 weeks. So that meant a lot of Irish women had to either stay in the country for 6 weeks or else travel back after 6 weeks to sign off on that adoption. And a lot of the time that just didn't happen because they didn't have the money or the accommodation to stay. So in those cases, the child then would have, the case would have been brought before the courts. In most of those cases, then those children would gone on to have the adoption approved, but it meant that children were often left in children's homes for a number of weeks before court date came up, and possibly several months or a year, up to a year, before it came before the courts. So the adoption system in the UK didn't really work in terms for Irish women in terms of that 6-week clause.
So usually the woman, it wouldn't be emigration then, she would just go over for the adoption and then return?
Yeah, so that's if she was emigrating specifically for adoption.
Yeah.
And I mean, sometimes they emigrated to try and, with the effort to keep their child, to try and find a work situation or, find a situation where she could keep her child, which is quite difficult, of course, as well.
Okay, and so the mother then would the young woman would go to London or Liverpool or Birmingham or whatever, and what would happen then? I mean, would the church then pick up where they'd left off?
Yeah, so there was a number of welfare organisations that were set up to deal with migrants, and then there was a number of welfare organisations that dealt with unmarried mothers. So Irish women would have been met by both groups there. Mainly they were religious welfare organisations, and so this is there is a strong tie between the welfare organisations and the church. And like as one of the cases that I was speaking about yesterday at another event, the one woman who was struggling to pay for adoption fees, she was paying the adoption fees back to the welfare organisation, the National Vigilance Association. What she didn't realise, but what we know from the archival records, is that that money that she was paying back to the welfare organisation was being sent straight to the Archbishop, the Catholic Archbishop. So there's a strong link between the organisations and the church.
Right, and that's a shock, isn't it? I mean, these organisations were just quasi-religious, were they? Or
yeah, and you know, it's like the bishops say that they have nothing to do with this area, that it was the nuns and the religious congregations, but I think that really isn't true, and especially for, you know, some bishops more than others. But I'd just like to point out actually Bishop Lucy, the Archbishop of Cork, in 1954 founded the St. Anne's Adoption Society. And so that society was specifically set up to return Irish Catholic children to St. Patrick's Orphanage. And then the children were then, after being taken from UK to Cork, and then were sent to America. So there was a huge transport system happening there. So
would the mother be aware of this?
So she was aware that she was given the child up for adoption. She might not have been aware that the adoption would be to America. That was not always clear. But there would have been a lot of pressure on the mother to put the child up for adoption. And we know that forced adoptions happened. We've seen it time and time again in the oral testimonies.
Just to be clear then, the child would be adopted in Britain, but would return then to Cork and then go to the States, go to America. So
it actually wouldn't be adopted in Britain. The mother might have had the baby in Britain in an attempt to kind of to avoid institutionalization and to avoid possibly adoption, but then would be repatriated by that group. The baby then would be put in an institution, and then subsequently adopted. Now, it could have been adopted in Ireland either, but we know that a lot of the time they were adopted to America.
Yes, of course, yeah. And God, Eunan, the Northern Ireland aspect of this. I mean, obviously, when a woman in Belfast, there's no need. I mean, could you introduce that element? Sorry, Eunan, please.
Yeah, well, basically, North of Ireland wouldn't have been any different in many respects, although you're talking about legislation being first introduced in England in 1926, in Northern Ireland in 1929, and of course the South 1952, but not officially enacted until 53. You know, there was large and wide-scale trafficking facilitated by a lot of holding centres, strategically placed over and across the border from the north, in the likes of St. Clair's and Stabullen there, in County Meath, or County Louth, and you have, of course, St. Murray's Farm in Donegal. You even had the castle that was only established in the 1980s and ran up until 2006. So there was a massive networking of children being moved across the border, even from the likes of the Sisters of Nazareth in Sligo to Derry, and then on to other places. Obviously, we had the famous child migrant scheme in the 1950s as well, that took a lot of children to Australia and America. Of course, like last week, we talked about other organisations that were involved here, the charitable organisations like Barnardo's, Dr. Barnardo's, and the Salvation Army, who obviously migrated hundreds of thousands of children over a century into Canada and America, the USA, and Australia. So I suppose in Ireland, the very fact that both the Protestant and the Catholic Church did not recognise any legal jurisdictions in terms of a border, they basically used their own diocesan channel of moving children across the borders to wherever they were going to go. And of course, we know that many children in the north, for example, had their names and from the south to facilitate the trafficking to America, especially had their names changed on ships' manifests, especially the American naval carriers, where a child's surname would have been, or their Christian name would have been changed to a military rank to get them onto the ship's manifest. So we know that the Irish Office of External Affairs, basically in the south as well, signed off on many passports and visas for northern children as well, obviously as the southern children. So there's an extensive network. None of this happened by accident. This was a system basically that worked globally. It was not discriminate in terms of any particular religious congregation either, and it was not discriminate in terms of any faith either, because we know that the Protestant Church, and as I said, their offshoot denominational charitable organisations were heavily involved in this as well. So, again, trafficking is an issue that has been the major elephant in the room in any type of research, statutory investigation, commission, or whatever it is, has never been looked at and robustly investigated either in the north or the south. So, given the extensive, wide-ranging, complicit actors in this and the facilitation, by GPs, legal professionals, private adoption agencies, the politicians that were involved, right up until every level of government. It's no wonder that obviously the governments of today don't want to take this issue on.
No. Tell me, Lorraine, on the you mentioned adoption fees. The mother would still have to pay adoption fees. How did that work?
Yeah, she would. And just to pick up on Eunan's point there, I actually came across the movement of women from institutions from Northern Ireland to Scotland in some records that I came across actually. So in January 1959 to February 1950, 5 women were moved from institutions from the south and the north of Ireland to institutions in Glasgow. And I just happened to come across that when I was in the archive in Glasgow. But yeah, on adoption fees were usually the mother was pressured to pay for them. And I
wasn't even aware that there was such a thing as adoption fees. But
yeah, there were. In 1926, one case, Catherine, the adoption fee was £50, and she was unable to pay the fee. So she contacted her child was in St. Patrick's Home, with St. Patrick's Guild, in St. Patrick's Home in Dublin. And she contacted the National Vigilance Association in London, where she was at the time, to help her pay the fee. Now they did agree to pay the fee, and she paid them back in installments. She was under serious pressure to pay back the fee, and they even threatened to go into her place of work, which was the hospital. So if I could just actually read out, because I have it here in front of me.
Please.
There was a few different letters from Catherine to the NVA saying how difficult she was finding it to meet the fees. And then she said, "Dear sir, I'm really grieved to think that I've caused you such annoyance. Enclosed is the £1.10 amount due. And she received a reply that said, "I will try and forget that little episode, but I very much hope that you will make it unnecessary for me to write again. And then I have not heard from you in some considerable time. If I do not hear from you within a week, I shall send a lady round to call on you at the hospital where she worked." So there was a lot of pressure for her for this not to happen because she may lose her job. She feared her job. So then she received another letter that said, "I do not wish to be unsympathetic, but I want you to appreciate the position. You best clear off those errors." So there was significant pressure on Catherine to be punctual about the payments. It was the fact that they might not hear from her for some weeks and then she would pay some, and she was finding it quite difficult to meet the payments. Then there was this was the case where then the repayments were actually being sent back to the Archbishop then. So from the NVA to in a letter to Catherine from the NVA, it said, "You have been released of the agreement and can now start a life as a perfectly free woman. Although I may have seemed unsympathetic in the past, it was for your own good." So it was kind of seen as a way of paying for her sin.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Lorraine, they'd already made a lot of money on the child, though, hadn't they, at this stage? If it was a healthy baby.
yeah,
So
they would have received donations for the child who was adopted as well.
Yeah.
So this was a huge, huge economic business here.
And we were speaking just before about like a middle class person could probably go to London and go through this,
Yeah.
but a working class girl would end up in a mother baby home.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, it really depended if you had enough money to travel, if you had enough for accommodation. So there was accommodation fees as well for the mother and baby homes.
Yeah.
So in the UK, the homes, there was a huge disparity between the payments, the weekly payments in the different homes, and that kind of determined middle class homes from working class homes.
Okay.
So if you could afford the higher fees, you were in a nicer home. So yes, then there was cases where women might not be able to meet the fees, and then they would pay back in installments again to pay back for their keep.
Right.
There's a number of different avenues there.
Why would women be taken from, say, Belfast to Glasgow, or from Northern Ireland to just to get them away from the community they're in?
I don't understand why they were sent. I mean, I found that just in the minutes of meetings at between just one, it was the Scottish Council for the Unmarried Mother and Her Child. There was only a few lines about it, and I've been able to find out very little since. I don't even know which exact homes that they were from, and there's very little record. There's very little.
Yeah,
John, I was just going to interject there. Really, that I have seen parish records. You know what I mean, where women have came from the likes of Glasgow and London, and obviously a whole multitude of counties from the south of Ireland to the institutions in the north, and in particular I would be referring to Marianville here, where I've seen parish records on baptismal registers where these women are named as coming from various parts of Scotland and England. So in some of these cases here, that might be a repatriation case there as well at the end of the day. You know what I mean? Where these women effectively had their children and then went back to the countries that they originally came from. And of course, given the fact that a lot of these women were automatically discarded and disowned by their families as well, they might have found channels available to them to then make it across the water. And of course, we know that in some of the institutions involved here that women in some cases, to, I suppose, reinforce the secrecy, in a lot of cases actually set up channels or other people than you that lived in other countries in the likes of Scotland and England there, and they would use them as a postal address. They might have told their families, or their families might have said to them, listen, you're not actually going to where you're supposed to be going. You're going to the north instead of England or Scotland. We'll set up a postal address for you, or sometimes they set it up for themselves to send letters back and forth to make it look like they were actually somewhere else as an excuse.
Yeah.
And to pick up on what Lorraine was also saying here about the fees were very, very quickly changed to donations, of course, because under the adoption legislation, it was illegal to pay for any kind of an adoption. So that was automatically and conveniently changed to the word donation that the religious orders would have been asking for. And of course, we do know as well that in many cases, a lot of the women and the children in the institutions themselves, sometimes the prospective adoptive parents would have been paying for the maintenance of the woman and the child, and the parents of the woman might have been paying for the girl or the woman to be in the institution, the child as well. Obviously, they've been getting money from the state, so the money was coming in hand over fist. And of course, that also brings into the fact that, you know what I mean, in a lot of cases, births and deaths wouldn't have been registered for sometimes months and years after the event. So that again was going to facilitate and make sure that there was a constant train of money coming into the institution for either the mother or the baby or both. You know, this is the type of sort of illegal money launderer, I suppose, and all aspects of profiteering that was going on, you know.
And a pregnant woman then is a value really in terms of, in so many ways, you know, for the next 2-3 years or so, they can sell the child.
Yeah.
And Lorraine, was it you who discovered from the interim report about children that had been taken for anatomical research, the bodies had been, sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's another project that I'm working on at the moment. So
I was just thinking in terms of, like, God, even the organs at the end, even the anatomical remnants.
I suppose, I mean, and this happened with adults as well who were in institutions, so county homes, it could have been psychiatric institutions. Their remains would have been taken if their body, the legislation said if the body was not claimed within 48 hours. Now we know that the 48 hours wasn't always adhered to. Then it was removed to a medical school for medical examination.
And they would have paid when they had medical school, would have had to pay for that.
Yeah.
So that's another.
So there's another transaction happening there as well. Yeah, and that would have included infants. Now, like, I was looking specifically at Galway Medical School.
Sure.
I couldn't see any connection to Tuam Mother and Baby Home, which was what I was quite interested in.
Yes.
But infants were removed from the university hospital, or the regional hospital in Galway, as it was called at the time. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I didn't want to go off track. How many women are we talking about in terms of from, say, 1926 to your studies go from the 20s to the 80s, really, don't they?
I mean, I can't say how many, thousands. I can't possibly give a figure, because I was looking at just 7 welfare organisations was what I focused in on, and that included looking at 12 mother and baby homes in the UK. Within those records, I found 67 cases of Irish women, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't more. Of course there was more, they're just not in the records. Because we don't have very complete records. A lot of the records are missing, are incomplete. You know, there's years, decades missing from some of them.
Even organisations like NVA and.
Yeah, even the NVA, you see, is really, they were more interested in looking after migrant women. So to find Irish unmarried mothers within that, what was really time consuming and difficult, and I happened to find just a few, but I mean, you're relying on caseworkers' notebooks from the 20s to be complete, you know, so it's not a complete record.
Right.
So
But your researchers are dealing with people who went to mother and baby homes in Britain, and
yeah,
people who obviously went to London, Liverpool, and then after 67, possibly abortions. The
yeah.
adoptions then trailed off, I would imagine.
Well, what was really interesting was I kind of expected a shift, and it wasn't really there. What was really interesting about the 60s in the institutions in Britain was there was an influx of migrants from former colonies, and all of a sudden this stigma that was there against Irish unmarried mothers, there was now coloured women, and they spoke a lot about coloured women in the records. So there was a lot of stigma and a lot of racism actually towards those women
Sure.
in the 60s. And it actually appeared that they there was less British women themselves in the homes from the 60s and 70s. And it was mainly migrant women, and still a high population of Irish women as well. So Irish women were still traveling over, entering institutions and putting their children up for adoption. That was still common into the 70s.
Yeah. Well, I remember, I mean, I'm old enough that there was distinctly, and Breeda perhaps can remember this, and in the 80s, there was a distinct period, like a year or two, where just single mothers were not stigmatized. They became accepted, not accepted, but certainly the stigma attached to them had gone within a couple of years. I don't know. I don't know if you remember that too, Breeda.
Well, yeah, I think, when we look today, we've heard of the Kerry babies again and the settlement for Joanna Hayes and her siblings and family. And that was an absolutely terrible time. It was 1984. And Lovett given birth in the 80s in Ireland.
Yeah.
I think when Ireland joined the EEC, and that was in the 70s, obviously, things began to get a little better for the unmarried mother. They were beginning to get rights and entitlements, but the stigma remained. And I think in Britain as well, there was a certain stigma because the Irish community was quite large in Britain. A lot of Irish immigrated for job opportunities. And the women became known, those who had babies and attempted to hide it, and who had either given their child up for adoption or thought that they would secure their child at a later time. That was one of the reasons as well, I think, possibly, Lorraine, that when they went to the UK, there was an opportunity 6 months following the birth for them to get back the child. And very few mothers wanted to leave their child behind. They were coerced and pressured, but not in the same way as they were pressured within Ireland or Irish institutions who reminded them of their sin. It was a perceived sin. It was they were spoken to in the most derogatory fashion. They didn't receive any pain control. They remained stigmatized into the 80s, I would say, regardless of how it may have seemed growing up in the 80s. It was certainly getting better, but I think the unmarried mother, even in the 1980s, still felt a certain shame and wasn't regarded as a married mother, with the same rights, entitlements, respect from her own community many times. And it could be the local community. And I said before that prior to 1922, it's my own opinion that women, Irish women, certainly unmarried Irish women, single women, had better opportunities for advancement in life and for, to reach their potential in a way that they didn't have once the church became overbearing, and Archbishop McQuaid and the mother and child scheme, which was for children up to the age of 16. And had that come in for children up to the age of 16, certainly rights and entitlements would apply to children within institutions, one would think. Instead, when it was brought in for children up to 6 weeks, mother and child up to 6 weeks. So, the state continuously looked down upon these women and allowed the church to take over, to do the work that they, you know, it was subcontracted. It was work that the state really didn't want to do. And I think that's where the responsibility lies, because the tragedy is many mothers who went to England remained away from their families for life. There was never, you know, a chance for them to return. And so they suffered indefinitely. And even when their child may have reached out to them in their latter years, Archbishop Diarmuid Martin spoke about this recently. And he spoke when he was then a priest. A young boy had come to him who had been in the institutions. And he said, I want to find my mother. And the Archbishop, who was a priest, said, we will look for her. So they went to the mother and baby home where this boy had been born. And the nun, you know, said, oh, she had no interest in him. She's, you know, she wasn't motherly. So they took that with a pinch of salt, and eventually they tracked down the mother. But what he found, and he was quite upset speaking about it, was that the mother and child could never be reunited in the way that those years had escaped them. In the way that, you know, many of the adopted children perhaps have the same reaction even now. But because the bond was severed so harshly, they didn't have the opportunity to return, you know, the relationship. So Archbishop Diarmuid Martin cried on radio a few weeks ago speaking about this, and he was pretty genuine, I believe, because he felt the shame. He said the joy in the woman's face when she realized it was her son. She was working in a bar cleaning, and they walked in, and he said, do you remember a little boy? And she looked at him, and her face was just joyous for that period of time. But it shows what, to me, what Ireland has done, what we have done to our own citizens, and how we owe them so much. You know, it breaks my heart that there are women today throughout Ireland, and children of those women who are kept apart, and who the women who have never spoken and who probably will never speak. If there's one thing I could say, it would be today, you know, you've done nothing wrong. The state has failed you. And if you would like to talk about it, now is the time, because we're a much more accepting society, I would like to think.
I have a relative who in the early 60s became pregnant, went to London, and for 5 days the priest came over and stayed with her, trying to persuade her to take the child back to Ireland. Was that common, Lorraine? That the mother was sort of lured back to the village or whatever, I mean, I don't know what fate would have awaited her, but she didn't. She refused to for 5 days. But
to return home to her home community, was it?
Well, I'm curious, and she would be curious to know what would have happened then the child. And presumably, he was so eager because of the value of the child. Was that ostensibly the issue?
It's not something that I've come across. But there was instances, say, where women would have contacted their local priest and said, you know, I'm in trouble and I need to leave the country, and they would have helped them do that, you know, because of their connections over in Britain, and would have kind of actually organised for them to be met by one of the welfare organisations or whatever. So there was that informal, I suppose, assistance as well at the local level. Obviously.
But the majority would be women who would go over and secretly.
Yeah, they would be going, not having told anyone in their community, or, you know, quite often not even their own families. And, you know, I mean, many of the priests, you know, from a hierarchical level, you know, the church was completely against the the migration of these women. And, you know, their kind of take on it was that, well, all of these young women are emigrating and then shortly getting into trouble after they arrive because of the immoral way in Britain, rather than actually accepting that a lot of these women were migrating because of the fact that they were pregnant. And they were very much against that, and would have really pressured them into entering in an institution in Ireland, you know, for obvious reasons, as we talked about. Yeah.
Eunan, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, John, I wanted to bring in, there's a highly significant sort of factor in all of this as well, and that would be proselytism, which is basically the fear of the Catholic Church and you know, the children of Irish women, and particularly obviously Irish profess to be Catholic women, and their children being handed over to be reared in the Protestant faith. Yeah. So you know, as Lorraine rightly alluded to earlier, a lot of women under all sorts of circumstances made their way to England to avoid institutionalization, and for them the lesser of two evils was in some cases to hand their children over to Protestant adoptive families, rather than for themselves and their babies to spend any time at all in a mother and baby institution or a Magdalene laundry. So you know, that was an overreaching factor for the Catholic Church. It was extremely worried about children of any aspect, under any circumstances, being handed over to the Protestant faith. And of course, you know, there were many operational Protestant denominational mother and baby institutions and Magdalene laundries, of course. The Protestant Church has the glorious accolade of setting up the first mother Magdalene laundry in Ireland, North and South. So, you know, and then thereby plenty of mother and baby institutions. We obviously have a good variety in the north as well here. But, you know, this was a major factor. You know, even the Irish government became at different points actually embarrassed at the amount of Irish women that were in England. And so they were making best efforts to try and get them women back on the Irish shores under whatever situation, and get them put into an institution here or reintegrated into the society in whatever form. But you know, and of course there were Irish women already in England who were there under different circumstances, maybe working in domestic services or way over there to get jobs. And you know, there are reports that even some of those Irish women were even embarrassed about the Irish women that were coming over, and also giving them a bad name, so to speak. So it just shows you, you know what I mean? And of course, England had no moral superiority when it came to these issues either, because, you know, there's over 500 mother and baby institutions in between England, Scotland and Wales. You know what I mean? So, you know, they were prevalent, and then you can go into wider Europe as well. You can go into Belgium, the Netherlands and Hungary, and all sorts of European countries that run these mother and baby institutions as well. You know, I told a girl about St. Anne's orphanage in Canada, for example, and they rigged up their own electric chair, actually for a children's institution, mainly for the Canadian Indigenous children, and basically wired up a battery to a chair to electrocute some of the children in their own children's residential institution, run by a Catholic religious congregation. So this is extensive around the world. This is something like people like Breeda and myself and Lorraine, I suppose, through our repatriation and our migration studies, have tried to tell people, you know what I mean, that Ireland is not by any means an isolated incident in any form. And you know, this basically is about us trying to expose and raise awareness about the fact that this was so extensive and widespread and systemic in so many countries around the world, you know.
With all these,
Ireland was not unique at all, and I think that's why I really wanted to do this project, was to actually see, well, what's happening over in Britain. And just to pick up on that point, Eunan, as well, of a lot, time and time again when I was looking at the records, the homes would be talking about either a Catholic woman entering a Protestant home or a Protestant woman entering a Catholic home, and then the home feeling pressure to move them to the correct one, where the woman would enter and not necessarily care that it was not of her own religion. But this what led to a lot of tension between the homes and between the welfare organizations, huge tension.
Yeah.
And what was happening was a lot, because the Catholic homes, there's tended to be a lot more overcrowding, and so the Irish women were entering the Protestant homes, and the Catholic homes were particularly aggressive about them taking, like, not admitting them and sending them to the Catholic home, even though they were overcrowded and didn't have the room. And that came up time and time again in the records.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, this goes back to the adoption practices as well, where in Ireland, the Catholic religious organisations and congregations, it was far easier for people from foreign countries to get, adopted Irish children, because of the way the Catholic Church in particular handled their adoptions, and not wanting to actually personally meet, for example, the prospective adoptive parents. Whereas actually some of the Protestant organisations did insist on that the prospective adoptive parents would come and they would actually meet them and talk to them and interview them. Whereas the Catholic organisations, basically the criteria and the stipulation was, okay, will you rear this child as a Catholic? Basically, what money do you have? And that was basically it. And of course, America, for example, had adoption legislation in from 1851, 100 years previously. But of course, there was many stipulations to that, and it's sort of fairly restrictive in terms of age and income, and even your race. So this was why there ended up being such a baby black market. You know what I mean? That the American companies especially were coming to Ireland to, I suppose, try and mitigate any possibility of a Negro bloodline in Ireland as well. But of course, we still ended up with many mixed race people in the institutions here as well, regardless. But the Americans would have insisted in a lot of cases, obviously because of their white supremacist attitudes, etc., that they get an Irish child that had mainly, I suppose, looked like an Aryan child, from the old Nazi sort of terminology. And of course, this brings in eugenics in many ways as well, So, I mean, it's such a complicated set of issues that we're talking about here.
Eunan and Breeda and Lorraine, in terms of jurisdictions, these are crimes against humanity. These are trafficking. Surely, British law, American law. I mean, is that not operable at the moment, even still, to punish people for these crimes, or to? I mean,
yeah, and I think that absolutely, like, they should be. I know that there are individuals taking their cases to courts, but it's very difficult to do that. And this is why I think the commission, like, it really has to, and the government here just really has to own up to this and what's gone on. And like, even their attempt to seal records now is
well,
just
they're still at it today, weren't they, Breeda? I was reading Dr. Mabel Rourke's Twitter feed, and more confidentiality on top, just a sort of confusion and a sense of...
Yeah, and I think it's intentional confusion,
Yeah. And the constant delays as well. It's of the actual report. I mean, Breeda, you feel this more than anybody.
Well, for survivors, obviously, it's been, there have been 4 delays since they began. And while the report will be out on the week of the 11th of January, it'll probably be the Friday of that week when it actually comes. It's going to be 3,000 pages, harrowing reading, appendices. I'm not sure. I desperately hope that the voices of the survivors, of those who have given their testimonies, will really be the central part, because this is, for the first time, I suppose, certainly for mother and baby homes, it's a proper research document. And while it doesn't go far enough, it has a narrow remit. It is akin to, we'll say the Ryan report or the McAleese report, any reports that have been done from a state, from a statutory body. But it's how we address it once it's released, and how the state itself responds to the plight. Now, I think in particular, you've talked about mixed race and about traveller children who were also in the institutions. And I think there has to be a special focus on, because for anybody who's listened ever to Rosemary Adasser or Conrad or Jude or Catherine Coffey O'Brien speaking of the travellers, all of those particular groups were again doubly disadvantaged, if you like, and were stigmatized even more because they would never get the opportunity to be fostered out or adopted, and they would always be beaten, and much more so than the other children. So I would hope all of that is in the report, but John, we're waiting,
But one thing we do know, that the women that you're talking about, Lorraine, or that we've talked about this evening, won't be in that report at all, and they're completely...
No, it's not within the remit of the commission, so yeah. I would be surprised if they were in there. I don't think they're not expected to be.
No, they need their own, perhaps. They need their own commission investigation. Perhaps then you will be hopefully involved in that, Lorraine. Lorraine, thank you so much. I don't know what we've concluded tonight. Eunan, do you know, there's no real particular answer to this one. This is just another aspect of the story, really, isn't it?
Yeah, well, what we've covered tonight basically focuses on, I suppose, the forced migration in many ways, a lot of coercion, lack of consent, even anatomical research that Lorraine talks about there. Consent is a big issue there, You've got consent and you've got informed consent, There's all sorts of issues here. The trafficking obviously would run into the repatriation, the migration, what happened there to the children and the women that came back and forward, the north-south trafficking, and of course, as I say, it's a major elephant in the room. It's something that nobody wants to touch. It's a real hot potato in terms of the subject matter and the implications of it as well. And of course, the implications of it run into obviously the access to records as well, because it's effectively created this major diaspora around the world. So you've got the Irish people that moved across to different countries for all sorts of reasons. But in a lot of cases, what we're talking about here was coercion and deliberate, systemic, forced migration of a lot of people at the end of the day, and how that was facilitated by the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, and the states on both sides of the border here as well. So it's actually, there's huge issues here that have still not been addressed, and whether they will or not obviously is another question. But the state, of course, and we've had it here, we've listened to it recently up here, that in terms of the trafficking, they'll say we don't really know how extensive it was, because of course a lot of the secrecy, the confidentiality, the criminality and the illegality that carried out some of this trafficking pertains, to some of the individuals in themselves, and unless they come forward and actually show any documentation that they might have, we will never know the full extent. And then, of course, because so many of the adoptees were illegally and criminally adopted, you're never going to find out anyway. And some of those adoptees will never find out even that they've been adopted as well. So they're hugely complex issues.
Well, thanks. Well, I hope we've given some sort of understanding of another aspect of it tonight. Eunan, Duffy, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Breeda Murphy, thank you very much. And Dr. Lorraine Grimes, hopefully we'll have you on again, maybe before the report is out or when the report does come out.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And thank you very much. And thanks for all your research and all your hard work. And hopefully, Breeda and Eunan, I'll see you guys next week. And thank you very much for joining us. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, John. Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Take care, everybody.